Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is terms, mathematical terms, literary terms. Terms thrown around a lot. People use them and they have meaning, but not what they are commonly understood to mean. What am I speaking about specifically? I'm speaking about the terms proportionality regarding force and asymmetry regarding conflict. We think of these terms, proportionality and asymmetry, as simple math and literary terms, but they're actually legal terms in this context. What am I really talking about? I'm talking about the expression proportionate force. It does not mean what everyone thinks it means. It doesn't mean that they have rocks, so you need to use rocks. It doesn't mean they have handguns, so you need to use handguns. Most people often think about this disproportionate force to mean that one side is using jets and helicopters, tanks, armored personnel carriers against machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, rocks, or Molotov cocktails. That is absolutely wrong. Proportionate and disproportionate force is an issue of self-defense. Now, I say this, and it's important to understand it. All of this is outlined in the Fourth Geneva Convention. And again, it must be in self-defense. The Fourth Geneva Convention is established in 1949. It is a defensive concept, proportionality. It is not what people think. It's not about literature. It's not about math. It requires certain things. And those certain things, in terms of our understanding, are critical because without them, we misunderstand what's going on. Because after all, they are legal terms. They have requirements. Listen to what they are and decide for yourself. 1, you can use the amount of force necessary to remove the threat, but not more than what is necessary. Now that must be very clear. Use force, but not more than necessary to use force. That's critical. That's the first and primary issue with regard to the understanding of proportionality in terms of response. 2, you must avoid civilian casualties as much as possible. That doesn't mean avoid civilian casualties totally, but as much as possible. So you have to go through certain measures in order to prevent casualties of civilians. 3, you can use as much force as necessary so that the threat does not return, but not more than enough force, as much force as necessary. Now this is critical because it makes all the difference. Those 3 principles determine what it means to be proportionate or not proportionate in terms of your force in responding in a defensive operation. Obviously, I'm talking not just about Israel and Hamas, I'm talking in general. But you just can't throw out the words. The European Union law actually categorizes 4 stages, not the 3 that I gave, which was international law, but this is 4 stages of proportionality. They add an element to it. They have a test which is namely the following. 1, there must be a legitimate aim, they say, a measure. That means you have to articulate what it is. In the particular case of Israel in Gaza, it was to specifically search out the tunnels which were launching rockets against their civilians, a specific measure and aim. 2, the measure must be suitable to achieve the aim, potentially within the requirement of the evidence to show that it will indeed be effective. 3, that measure must be necessary to achieve the ends, and that there cannot be any less onerous way of doing it. In other words, there couldn't be another option, that this element of force has to be the option available. Without it, then it steps outside of that, those boundaries. And 4, the measure must be reasonable, considering the competing interest of difficulty and the different groups at hand. International human rights law understands the humanitarian issues. They do. And as a result, it's important for you to understand. For instance, the Rome Statute actually explains that the death of civilians during an armed conflict happens. No matter how grave, they are regrettable. It is sad. But it does not constitute a war crime in and of itself. In other words, killing civilians does not constitute a war crime. The international humanitarian law, explained as the Rome Statute, permits fighting parties to carry out proportionate attacks against military objectives, even when it's known that some civilian deaths or injuries will occur. A crime occurs, though, if there is an intentional attack against civilians. And that's critical because that is actually codified in international law. Codified in international law. So an attack is launched on a military objective in the knowledge that incidental civilians will be injured. That would clearly be excessive and hence non-proportionate or disproportionate activity. Now, this is very, very important in relation to the anticipated military advantage. Now, if we understand this, then we understand what's going on in terms of just simply creating the context of what's going on. Now let's turn to asymmetry, another math term. A square is symmetrical. A circle is symmetrical. They are exactly the same on both sides. That's what symmetry is. Asymmetry means the opposite of that. That is, both sides are not equal. In war and in international law, that's the same also. It means it's the same basic principle. However, in war it means that the sides do not use the same weapons or the same rules of war. That's what makes the difference. In this particular case, what we're speaking about here in terms of conflict, the weaker side uses tools to try to even the playing field. And by evening the playing field, they use things like terrorism, guerrilla fighting against the standing army. They also use uniforms versus non-uniformed fighters. They hide amongst civilians. They hide behind civilians. They use human shields. That creates the difference. It's a different set of rules, attacking civilians versus avoiding civilians at all costs. That makes the difference between the asymmetry in terms of rules. It's not just a question of values. It's a question of perspective in war, in the way in which they're conducting the war. We've got the whole history of this. It's not just contemporary in the world in which we're looking at today. It goes back. It's not clear, you should know, who has the advantage. Well, some would say, well, one side has the advantage because they have planes and jets. Another side, though, will say they have the advantage because they have the element of surprise. Because on the question of the symmetry and asymmetry, in order to not have disproportionate responses, it means that you really have to warn the civilians to get out of the way. And when you do that, you take away the element of surprise. In terror, the other side of the asymmetry, they use surprise as one of their most important and critical advantages. The sides are radically different, and both inflict dramatic damage. Coming up next, points of view. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. First up, a column called How the West Chose War in Gaza. It's a New York Times piece from July 18th, 2014. It's written by a character named Nathan Thrale. Now, Thrale is a senior analyst at the International Crisis Group. The group is an independent, non-governmental think tank established not so long ago, actually, considering think tanks, about 1995. It was created because there was no real group analyzing and anticipating some of the huge massacres that had occurred just before its inception. Massacres that took place in Somalia, Rwanda, Bosnia. And so this group sort of looks at things differently, and they don't look at it from a US-oriented perspective. And that already makes it very different. To give you a proof of this, half the op-eds that this think tank places are not in English. And Thrale's op-ed in the New York Times is an exception here. The International Crisis Group is trying to influence and shape world activities, world policy, leaders' points of view. Nathan lives in Jerusalem and deals with Gaza, Israel, Jordan, and the West Bank. I usually disagree with almost everything Nathan says, almost everything he writes, but it is always interesting. And this piece is no exception. But it's important to know, and for us to know, what he's talking about, what he's saying. This piece, by the way, also had some major parts lifted almost directly from an earlier piece written a few weeks earlier in the New York Review of Books. Thrill begins by saying, as Hamas fires rockets at Israeli cities and Israel follows up with its extensive airstrikes, with a ground operation in the Gaza Strip, the most immediate cause of the latest war has been ignored. And this is where it comes in, and this is a biting critique. He says, Israel and much of the international community placed a prohibitive set of obstacles in the way. The Palestinian national consensus, that's what the obstacles were in the way of. That was formed in early June. Thrill then suggests that the unity government between Hamas and the PA was sabotaged by Israel and the West, and that was the cause of the conflict between Hamas and Israel. He is correct about the sabotage. There's no question about that. Israel and the West, principally the United States, was trying to sabotage the unity government between Hamas and the Palestinians. But he is not correct about the conflict. He actually lays the cause of the conflict at the feet of the right in Israel and the right in the United States, whose, and this is his quote, obsessive focus on a problem we do not have, unquote. Thrill is wrong. Unity government between Hamas and Abbas, the PA, was wrong and against U.S. law. It was just against the law. It was also not in Abbas's advantage or in the advantage of the United States or in Israel to have a unity government with Hamas and Abbas. Yet nonetheless, Abbas agreed on it. And he agreed on it for its own reasons. So that's another conversation for another time. Abbas, though, will be stronger as Hamas becomes weaker. And that fundamentally is better for the Palestinians, it's better for the Israelis, it's better for the West, and it's better for the United States. Next up is a column from the New York Post by Jonah Goldbergs. Actually, it's syndicated all over the place. I just happened to get this copy from the New York Post. It's entitled, Attacking Israel with the Genocide Lie. It was published July 16th, 2014. Jonah is a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's the founder, or a founding editor, at the National Review online. He writes twice a week for that, and he has a syndicated column which comes out once a week. It's in the New York Post, Chicago Tribune, the LA Times. Jonah is a neocon in all of its glory, but he also has spectacular bona fides. He's out there as a conservative voice in the most significant papers in America. He's part of a new breed of conservatives. He begins the following way. Here's the difference, he says, between us. He's quoting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, explaining on Fox News Sunday, quote, we're using missile defense to protect our civilians. They're using their civilians to protect their missile. And this is a huge canard that he's going to attack now. This is very, very interesting. The canard, and he now begins a series of attacks to try to understand the difference and the disparity between Hamas and Israel, between democracies and the terrorist organization. The canard of Israel perpetrating a genocide on the Palestinians is ugly and wrong. Jonah Goldbergs either says either you've got one way that the Israelis are the worst ever at genocide, or that they're just not doing it properly at all. For instance, he says, and this is the quote, the Israeli army is supposed to be ruthlessly competent and determined to wipe out the Palestinians. On the other hand, the Palestinian population has grown more than 100% since 1970. And the population in Gaza has grown nearly threefold, which is 300% since 1990. Unquote. So that's the end. So he says, Goldbergs says, hey, it's either one or the other. You can't be a great genocidal person or a group or state, and on the other hand, have a society which has grown either twofold or threefold. That's just nuts. So he ends, though, with probably one of the most famous lines in all of media and all of sales and marketing, in all of PR and the whole concept of branding. He ends with Joseph Goebbels, the great Nazi thinker who helped Hitler perpetrate the great lie. And this is what he says. If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually believe it. That's the end of his piece. One should know that it's out of bounds calling a Jew a Nazi. It's just out of bounds. And so when the Palestinians perpetrate this genocidal myth, it's wrong. The Jewish state is not perpetrating such a thing. It is not involved in such a thing, as the numbers show, as Goldberg showed in this piece. But it also shows when they say these kinds of things, that Jews are Nazis or that Israel is Nazis, it shows how little they know about Nazism and the Holocaust. Next up, John Podhoretz. He writes a piece called Behind Gaza's Woes, Why the Fight is So Unequal. And this also was published on July 16th. He begins by saying, the differences between Hamas and Israel are profound. It is as if the two are not living in the same century. The Hamas war against Israelis pits cheap rockets, basically the 21st century equivalent of exploding cannonballs, against a high-tech military so sophisticated that it can send a harmless, door-knocking bomb on the roofs of buildings to warn its targets inside that the next one will level it. This, by the way, is part of the operation which is called Knock on the Roof. Israel has a policy of knocking on the roof of places that they're going to hit. And they send this rocket, and you can actually see this rocket, and the harmless rocket, sort of a smoke grenade, which shoots right there on the spot. And you see a plume of smoke, and you start counting 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, until eventually you hit about 54, 56, or maybe 61, 62. About a minute later, another missile comes and literally levels the place where the first rocket was. It gives them time to leave. Podhoretz says that 9 years ago, Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, and that 7 years ago, Hamas took over Gaza by ousting the PA in a bloody coup. Podhoretz concludes that it's not a fair fight, and then he says, thank God for that. You see, what Podhoretz is saying is that there is a significant difference between Israelis and the people they're fighting. It's not just the rules. It's not just the rules of war. It's not just a question of that. It's not just their weapons. It's also a question of their values. Coming up next, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. The first cartoon up is from the Fatah Facebook page. Now, I focus on Fatah for a reason. It's from July 9th, 2014, but it tells you what they're telling themselves. Now, remember, Fatah is the main organization within the Palestinian Authority. It's not some fly-by-night activity. It's not kids in the basement putting together their Facebook page. This is an official page of the Palestinian Authority's major group. All right? And it's not for children. It's not for any of that. So it's worth thinking about. In this particular cartoon, a child is running away with a plate in one hand, a fork in the other. On his back, it says Gaza. Now, a missile is coming down right at him, right? And the missile is actually in the shade, in the shadow of an F-16. So you could see that all those images are right there. As it's coming down, you see the back of the missile has a swastika on it. So obviously, the image is very, very powerful. The cartoon is called, in the caption, Israel bombs Gaza. Where does that swastika fit in? Okay, maybe if it said something like a Star of David on the bomb. But why did it have to say a swastika? Because what they're doing is they're paralleling, Fatah, in creating this cartoon, is paralleling Israel's actions in Gaza to the Nazis' actions in Europe in the murder of millions upon millions of Jews. And I think that that really pushes the envelope a little too far. This next cartoon is called, actually it describes a Jew biting the hand of a Palestinian child. It's found in the main newspaper of El Hayat Al Jadida on July 3rd, 2014. The newspaper actually is the voice of the Palestinian Authority. So what happens? Why is a Jew biting the hand of a Palestinian, while at the same time in the front is an Israeli soldier? The Israeli soldier is right there, not watching, but his back is to it. The soldier sort of turns away. And by the soldier turning away, what happens is that the very ugly, archetypical Jewish character with a humongous nose has the hand of this Palestinian child in his mouth and is biting it off, and the soldier is doing nothing to protect that child, and actually doing nothing to arrest the perpetrator, the Jew who's doing this. The obvious link is the cartoonist is saying that Israel is allowing Jews to kill and harm Palestinian children. They're permitting it. Now, it's wrong, because all of you watching have to know that in response to something like this, it's simply politically not accurate. Because the Israelis actually went, searched, investigated, and arrested the Israeli Jews that were responsible for harming that Palestinian youth, for killing him, for murdering him so butcherly. That was very, very important for us to recognize. The cartoonist didn't just push the envelope here. The cartoonist made up something, and that's deeply troubling. The next cartoon is Nick Anderson, and this comes from July 21st in the Houston Chronicle. This, I think, is hilarious. Now, sometimes we just have to laugh because of what's going on. And cartoonists, especially in America, have a very biting and sometimes creative spirit that utilizes children and toys and babies and everything else. And here's the example. The piece actually shows a Russian surface-to-air missile, and on it is written, Ukrainian separatists. As a baby is calling the missiles toys. So a baby's right there in the foreground, looking at the Russian missiles, and says, "Oh wow, my new toys to play with." So this piece from the Houston Chronicle sort of bitingly challenges the nature of what's going on in terms of understanding the Russian relationship with Ukraine, and of course the Ukrainian separatists who shot down that Malaysian airline. The next cartoon is from Daryl Cagle. Now, Cagle is the publisher of politicalcartoons.com. He's the publisher of Cagle.com. He is a person who's really moved political cartoons into the internet and then has created a new form of political cartoonists so that they can get their message out, not just to the classic newspapers that are dying. So the new piece here, and this is interesting, so we seldom see his stuff, but when we do, I jump on it. The new Gaza missile defense system has been rolled into position, says one character in the cartoon. He's saying it to another character. So two terrorists are together, and they're speaking to one another, and the new defense system is in place. And then you see the defense system. What is it? It's a rocket on a bassinet filled with 3 babies on top. In other words, what he does is Cagle says, hey, you've got this new defense system, which is called a human shield. Babies protecting their weapons, and the terrorists are putting these babies there in order to protect the things that they see as dear. Clearly not their children. Cagle is biting and very, very, very clear in his understanding here. In a moment, my own perspective and a few predictions. I want to think out loud with you now. As I predicted here on Thinking Out Loud on Shalom TV, social media is going to take a huge, major role in our news and in our wars. And recently, a New York Times article ran on the front page describing exactly what I predicted here on Shalom TV. They described how Hamas and Israel are both using YouTube and Twitter and other social media, how they use language and punch certain terms, certain words, how Hamas, let's say, for instance, always uses the expression, actually they have talking points which say, always use the expression, don't ever use the expression civilians without first adding innocent civilians. Don't use citizens without first adding innocent citizens when speaking to the press or going out online or doing anything in the social media. While Israel always refers to those very same people, the very same innocent civilians or innocent citizens, as human shields. And the Israelis constantly harp and pound away at that message, human shields. I predict that the language and the images will get even more gory, more gruesome, more problematic. In the future, they will continue to show us these images, these pictures, and at a certain point, many of them will be fabricated, as they have been already in this conflict. The conflict between Israel and Hamas, we've seen a whole slew of pictures which didn't come from the area, which came from Iran, which came from Syria, which came from other places, which came from other conflicts with Israel and Hamas. And it's important in the aftermath that we see and analyze these kinds of things, because ultimately, I will tell you that lies and partial truths will generate huge amounts of feelings and emotions. I also predict that the social media world will explode and spin out of control because of this. That's why conventional, old-fashioned media is so important. That's why it's so critical for us to realize that at a certain stage in time, there's such a thing as an editor. There's such a person as a professional journalist. There are professional commentators who actually have to stand up and account for what they've said and say when they do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing or write the wrong thing, correct it. Corrections are critical. In the social media world, it just doesn't happen. And when you're actually a propagandist, it doesn't matter if what you're saying is right or wrong. All that matters is that your message gets sent out. And that, to me, I must tell you, is deeply troubling and deeply problematic. Because we're in a world right now where there aren't enough editors, and there aren't enough responsible people in message, and there aren't enough people telling us what we should be saying or what we should be thinking and what we should be reading. And the reality is, not that there are thought police, I'm not speaking about that, but rather that there are principles, and there are standards, and there are ideas that we all have to fundamentally embrace. If we don't embrace them, we're teaching and expressing more propaganda than we are knowledge. And it becomes more about who's right and wrong than about learning and trying to figure out what the truth is. We've thought out loud about a lot today. And when we begin to look and think about some of these interesting concepts, it becomes clear to me that the thinking out loud process is actually an educational process. So now that you know what I've been thinking about, tell me what you're thinking about. Email me at micah@shalomtv.com. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that on buses in Israel, a biblical verse is posted? The verse reads from Leviticus 19:32, "You shall rise before the aged and show deference to the old." Now, this is very, very important because it's a beautiful and Jewish way to say to people who are riding the bus, but to the environment in general, please give your seat up to the elderly. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on Shalom TV.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.